Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the shadow of the gleaming Parthenon, where tourists now snap photos and marvel at architectural perfection, an Athenian woman once struggled up the rocky path, a heavy clay amphora balanced precariously on her head. The water inside sloshed with each careful step, water she had waited hours to collect from the public fountain, as other women gossiped and quarreled around her. Her shoulders ached from the previous day's weaving, her hands were raw from making lye soap, and her youngest child cried with fever at home. The grand temples rising above her were spaces she could rarely enter, built by politicians she could never vote for, in a democracy that excluded her entirely. This was ancient Greece, not just the Greece of philosophical discourse and Olympic glory, but the Greece of daily struggle, physical hardship, and stark inequality. The popular imagination holds Greece as the cradle of Western civilization, a golden age of rational thought, democratic ideals, and artistic achievement. We envision togas, symposia with flowing wine, and intellectual debates under Mediterranean skies. This romantic vision, while not entirely false, is woefully incomplete. The reality was far harsher, more complex, and frequently brutal. This account aims to strip away centuries of romanticization and reveal ancient Greece in its uncomfortable entirety. We will walk through crowded, refuse-filled streets, witness the casual violence of the slave market, smell the gangrene in primitive surgeries, and hear the wails of children abandoned on hillsides for the crime of being born female or imperfect. We will experience the terror of women during childbirth, the desperation of the urban poor, and the callous indifference with which human suffering was often met. Yet this is not merely an exercise in historical voyeurism. By understanding the genuine struggles and limitations of a civilization we so admire, we gain valuable perspective on human progress. We see how even brilliant societies can be blind to their most profound moral failings. We recognize patterns of oppression that have evolved but not disappeared. And perhaps most importantly, we develop a more honest appreciation for the real achievements of ancient Greek civilization, accomplishments all the more remarkable for having emerged from such difficult conditions. The story of ancient Greece is not diminished by acknowledging its shadows. It becomes more human, more relatable, and ultimately more instructive. So let us begin our journey not on the pristine steps of reconstructed temples, but in the messy, complicated reality of everyday Greek life, where glory and misery existed side by side, often separated by nothing more than the accident of birth. The physical environment of Greece shaped its civilization more profoundly than perhaps any other factor. Unlike the fertile floodplains of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greece offered a challenging landscape of mountains and fractured coastlines. Only about 20% of the land was arable, forcing communities to battle constantly against the limitations of their environment. The typical Greek farmer worked small, rocky plots with primitive tools, wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of thin soil. Drought was a persistent threat. A single failed harvest could mean starvation for an entire family. The Mediterranean climate, while pleasant in modern tourist brochures, brought scorching summers that withered crops and winters cold enough to kill the elderly and infirm in poorly insulated homes. Water scarcity dominated daily life. Natural springs were precious resources, often controlled by the powerful. In Athens, the construction of the Krounos fountain was celebrated as a major civic achievement, simply because it provided reliable public access to drinking water. Most households lacked running water entirely, meaning daily treks to public fountains, usually by women and children carrying heavy clay vessels. Even wealthy households depended on slaves to perform this exhausting task multiple times daily. The fractured geography created natural barriers between communities, contributing to the development of independent city-states rather than a unified nation. This isolation bred both innovation and paranoia. Each polis, city-state, developed its own customs, dialects, and often hostile attitudes toward neighboring communities. The mountains that made Greece so picturesque also made it inherently divisive. For coastal communities, the sea offered both opportunity and danger. Fishing supplemented meager agricultural yields, but was itself dangerous work. Storms could appear suddenly in the Mediterranean, capsizing small fishing vessels and drowning their crews. Pirates roamed freely, attacking vulnerable coastal villages and taking captives for the thriving slave markets. This challenging environment created a culture that prized resilience and cunning, qualities personified in the mythical hero Odysseus, celebrated not primarily for physical strength, but for his ability to outwit adversaries and survive against overwhelming odds. For the average Greek, daily life was a similar odyssey of endurance and adaptation. Forget the white marble columns and grand proportions we associate with Greek architecture. Those design elements were reserved for public buildings and temples, spaces dedicated to civic life and the gods. The actual homes of most ancient Greeks would shock modern visitors with their darkness, discomfort, and lack of basic amenities. The typical Greek house was constructed of unbaked mud brick on a stone foundation, materials that deteriorated quickly and required constant maintenance. Roofs were made of clay tiles that often leaked during rainstorms. Windows were small and few, covered with wooden shutters rather than glass, creating interiors that were dark and poorly ventilated. During winter, smoke from indoor hearths, necessary for cooking and heating, filled these spaces with lung-irritating particulates, while summer brought stifling heat that could not escape the thick walls. Inside, floors were typically packed earth, sometimes covered with reeds in wealthier homes. Furniture was minimal: wooden stools, simple tables, storage chests, and sleeping pallets stuffed with straw or wool. Even in prosperous households, beds were often just wooden frames with rope webbing supporting a thin mattress. Back pain was so common it was considered a normal condition of aging rather than a medical problem. Sanitation was primitive at best. Most homes lacked toilet facilities. Residents used chamber pots that were emptied into the streets or, for the slightly more considerate, into designated pits. In Athens, the Eridanos River effectively served as an open sewer. The stench in urban areas, particularly during summer, would have been overwhelming by modern standards. Lacking germ theory, Greeks had no concept of the relationship between this waste and the frequent outbreaks of disease that plagued their communities. Personal hygiene faced similar challenges. Without running water, bathing was infrequent and laborious, requiring water to be hauled from public fountains or wells. Public baths existed in some cities, but these were social spaces rather than hygienic necessities, and the water was rarely changed. The famous Greek emphasis on athletics and the oiled, perfected body applied primarily to wealthy men with the leisure to attend gymnasiums, not to the working poor who constituted the majority of the population. Pest control was another constant battle. Homes were regularly infested with mice, rats, flies, bedbugs, lice, and fleas, all vectors for disease. Cats were kept primarily as mousers rather than pets, but could hardly control the overwhelming vermin population. Food storage was particularly vulnerable. A significant portion of each harvest was lost to rodents and insects, further reducing already marginal food supplies. The Greek home was thus not primarily a place of comfort, but of basic shelter and essential functions. It's little wonder that Greek men spent most daylight hours outside the home in public spaces, while women worked continuously to maintain these difficult living environments. The home was less a sanctuary than a perpetual worksite, demanding constant labor simply to remain habitable. Disease was an omnipresent threat in ancient Greece, made worse by limited medical knowledge and primitive hygiene. The Greeks had no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Illness was attributed variously to imbalances in bodily humors, divine punishment, or miasma. Bad air believed to transmit sickness. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that even the most educated physicians often prescribed treatments that were ineffective or actively harmful. The Hippocratic tradition, while representing an important step toward empirical medicine, still operated within severe limitations. Greek physicians had no access to antibiotics, limited pain management options, and only the most rudimentary understanding of anatomy due to taboos against human dissection. Surgery was performed without anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium derivatives, with patients physically restrained as surgeons worked. Mortality rates for even minor procedures were staggeringly high, primarily from subsequent infections. Childbirth represented one of the greatest health risks for Greek women, attended typically by midwives rather than physicians, who were almost exclusively male and often forbidden from examining female patients. Women gave birth on special chairs designed to use gravity to assist delivery. Without modern medical interventions, complications like breech births or hemorrhage frequently proved fatal. Estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 10 women died in childbirth, with infant mortality reaching nearly 30% in the first year of life. These statistics help explain both the emphasis on fertility in Greek culture and the emotional distance many parents maintained from newborns until their survival seemed likely. Epidemic disease periodically devastated Greek communities. The famous plague of Athens, 430 to 426 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, killed an estimated 1/4 of the city's population, including the prominent statesman Pericles. Historical descriptions suggest it may have been typhoid fever, smallpox, or a viral hemorrhagic fever. Without understanding of quarantine principles or effective treatments, such outbreaks could only run their course, leaving devastation in their wake. Dental health was particularly poor. Without effective cleaning methods beyond chew sticks, primitive toothpicks, cavities and gum disease were nearly universal. Tooth extractions were performed without anesthesia using specialized forceps. Many Greeks were missing multiple teeth by early adulthood, contributing to digestive problems and malnutrition as they aged. Mental illness received mixed responses in Greek society. While some conditions were recognized as medical in nature and treated with various therapies including sleep, diet, and music, others were attributed to divine possession or punishment. Individuals with severe mental illness might be restrained at home, abandoned to wander as beggars, or in some cases granted special status as oracles or prophets, if their behavior could be incorporated into religious frameworks. Even the wealthy could not escape the fundamental medical limitations of the era. When Alexander the Great fell ill in Babylon at age 32, likely with typhoid fever or malaria, the most skilled physicians of the ancient world could do nothing but watch him die over the course of 12 days. This stark reality that wealth and power provided little protection against disease contributed to the Greek philosophical preoccupation with accepting the inevitable and facing death with dignity. The Greek diet was fundamentally shaped by scarcity. Unlike the abundance suggested by modern Mediterranean cuisine, ancient Greeks lived with the constant specter of hunger. Agriculture in the rocky Greek landscape was challenging, and yields were low. The Mediterranean triad of wheat, olive oil, and wine formed the backbone of the diet, but access to these staples varied dramatically by social class and location. Bread was the primary food for most Greeks, providing up to 70 to 80% of their daily calories. But unlike the varied artisanal breads we might imagine, most Greeks consumed a simple barley flatbread called maza, cheaper and easier to grow in the Greek climate than wheat, which was often imported at considerable expense. This coarse bread was frequently the only substantial food a poor family might eat for days at a time, perhaps flavored with a few olives or an onion. Protein was chronically lacking in the average diet. Meat was rarely consumed by ordinary people, appearing mainly at religious festivals when animals were sacrificed and their meat distributed. Fish was more common in coastal areas, but still relatively expensive. The poor relied on legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans as their primary protein source, prepared in simple stews or porridges that could be stretched to feed many mouths. The famous Greek symposia, with their elaborate meals and free-flowing wine, were exclusively the province of wealthy men. The symposium was as much about displaying social status as enjoying food, an opportunity for the privileged to distinguish themselves from the perpetually hungry masses. Meanwhile, poor citizens might spend up to 80% of their income simply acquiring enough calories to survive. Famine was a recurring threat. A single failed harvest could deplete a community's food reserves, and transportation limitations meant that importing food was often impossible for inland settlements. Historical records document desperate measures during famines, including consuming seed grain needed for the next planting, thus extending the crisis, eating normally inedible plants, and in extreme cases, reports of cannibalism. Athens, recognizing the strategic importance of food security, maintained special grain ships and established overseas colonies primarily to secure wheat imports. Food riots were a constant concern for Greek political leaders, who knew that hunger could transform normally law-abiding citizens into desperate revolutionaries. The vulnerability to famine shaped Greek religion as well. Agricultural deities like Demeter received particular devotion, and many religious festivals coincided with critical agricultural periods. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important religious rites in ancient Greece, centered on Demeter and her daughter Persephone, explicitly connecting their myth to the cycles of abundance and scarcity that dominated Greek life. Children felt the effects of food insecurity most acutely. Stunted growth and developmental issues were common among the lower classes. Wealthy families sometimes kept special slaves called pedagogues, who, among other duties, prevented privileged children from sharing their food with hungry lower-class playmates, an indication of how normalized childhood hunger had become. Even in times of relative plenty, nutritional deficiencies created health problems. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency was common despite the sunny climate, as children from poor families worked indoors or were kept wrapped in swaddling clothes. Anemia from iron deficiency affected a large percentage of women, contributing to complications during pregnancy and childbirth. The Greek preoccupation with moderation in diet, famously advocated by physicians and philosophers, had a practical dimension beyond moral considerations. In a society where food was precious, gluttony was both personally unhealthy and socially destructive. When we celebrate ancient Greek democracy, particularly the Athenian model, we perpetuate a sanitized version that bears little resemblance to the actual system. Far from being an egalitarian society where all voices mattered, Athenian democracy was explicitly designed to preserve power for a small, privileged minority while creating just enough participation to prevent revolution. The franchise in Athens was severely restricted. Only adult males with Athenian citizen parents could participate, excluding women, slaves, resident aliens, metics, and anyone whose parentage was questionable. Even among eligible citizens, the poor faced practical barriers to participation. Political meetings occurred during daylight hours, meaning those who needed to work couldn't attend without sacrificing their livelihood. While some public positions paid stipends, these were inadequate to support a family, effectively reserving political careers for those with independent wealth. The much celebrated random selection for some government positions, rather than ensuring true representation, actually served to prevent the formation of professional bureaucracies that might challenge elite power. Important roles like military generals were still elected, typically from prominent families with the education and connections needed to campaign effectively. Behind the democratic facade, wealthy families maintained disproportionate influence through informal networks, religious positions, and the liturgy system, whereby the rich funded public works in exchange for social capital and tax advantages. These oligarchic elements meant that despite theoretical equality, policy consistently favored elite interests. The exclusion of women from political life was nearly total. Athenian women couldn't vote, speak in public assemblies, serve on juries, or hold office. They couldn't even represent themselves in court, requiring a male guardian to speak for them. This exclusion wasn't merely practical, but ideological. Women were considered emotionally unstable and intellectually inferior, unfit for the rational deliberation democracy supposedly required. The contrast with modern democratic ideals becomes even starker when examining how Athenian democracy functioned in practice. The famous ostracism procedure, often cited as a safeguard against tyranny, was regularly manipulated by powerful factions to eliminate political rivals. The assembly could be swayed by skilled orators, using emotional appeals rather than reasoned arguments. Precisely the sort of demagoguery that Plato criticized in his skeptical analysis of democratic systems. Athenian democracy also displayed a dark imperial side. After forming the Delian League ostensibly to protect Greek cities from Persian aggression, Athens gradually transformed this alliance into an empire, using military force against member cities that attempted to withdraw. The democracy at home was partially funded by tribute extracted from these allied states, creating a parasitic relationship where Athenian democratic privileges depended on the exploitation of other Greek communities. Even the physical spaces of democracy revealed these contradictions. The Nix Hill, where the assembly met, could accommodate at most 6,000 citizens, a fraction of those theoretically eligible to participate. Archaeological evidence suggests that attendance was typically far lower, especially for routine matters, meaning that crucial decisions were often made by small, unrepresentative groups of citizens who had the leisure to attend regularly. The fragility of Greek democratic experiments is evident in how quickly and frequently they collapsed into tyranny or oligarchy. Athens itself experienced several democratic reversals, most notably the oligarchic coup of 411 BCE and the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants following defeat in the Peloponnesian War. These weren't aberrations, but revelations of the structural weaknesses in a system that never truly extended power beyond a narrow demographic. The philosophical defenses of democracy were themselves notably ambivalent. Even Pericles' famous funeral oration, often cited as the definitive celebration of Athenian democracy, focuses more on Athens' imperial greatness than on democratic principles, and was delivered in the context of a devastating war that Athens had arguably provoked through its aggressive foreign policy. What we might more accurately call Greek democracy was a limited experiment in distributing political power among free, property-owning men, one that explicitly depended on the systematic exclusion and exploitation of the majority of the population. Remarkable for its time, certainly, but hardly the egalitarian ideal that later democratic movements would aspire to create. To be born female in ancient Greece was to enter a life of systemic restriction and control. While variations existed between city-states and social classes, the fundamental pattern remained consistent. Women were considered intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, and in need of male governance throughout their lives. A Greek woman existed in a state of perpetual legal minority. She passed from her father's authority to her husband's through arranged marriage, typically as a teenager to a man in his 30s. If widowed, she would return to her male relatives' control unless she had adult sons. She could not represent herself in legal proceedings, conduct substantial business independently, or own significant property in her own right. Physical restriction accompanied legal limitation. Respectable women, particularly in Athens, were largely confined to the women's quarters gynaeconitis of the household, while poorer women necessarily worked outside the home, selling goods in markets, laboring in fields, or serving as nurses and midwives. Middle and upper-class women were expected to remain indoors, emerging primarily for religious festivals and family funerals. This seclusion was so normalized that orators could attack political opponents simply by claiming their female relatives had been seen in public too frequently. Education for girls was minimal and focused entirely on domestic management. While boys might learn reading, mathematics, music, and athletics, girls typically received only enough literacy for household accounts and practical skills for managing slaves and producing textiles. Intellectual pursuits were considered not merely unnecessary, but potentially dangerous for women, whose weaker minds might be corrupted by too much knowledge. Marriage in Greece functioned primarily as a property arrangement between families rather than a romantic union. The bride had little say in the selection of her husband, and marriages were often contracted when girls were 14 to 15 years old, though the wedding might be delayed until they reached greater physical maturity. The age gap between spouses, men typically married in their late 20s or 30s, created marriages with built-in power imbalances beyond the legal disparities. The wedding ceremony itself symbolized the woman's new status. The bride would burn her childhood toys, be ritually bathed, and processed to her new husband's home, where she would perform ceremonies at his household hearth, symbolizing her transfer from one man's household cult to another's. The marriage would be consummated with witnesses nearby to ensure its completion, and the blood-stained sheets might be displayed as proof of the bride's virginity. Childbearing was considered a woman's primary purpose, and her status depended heavily on producing legitimate male heirs. Fertility problems were almost always blamed on the woman, regardless of the actual cause. Pregnant women were surrounded by superstitions and restrictions, with scientific understanding of pregnancy being minimal. Childbirth typically occurred at home with female relatives and a midwife assisting. Male physicians were rarely involved, except in emergencies. The Greek gynecological understanding was primitive and often harmful. The Hippocratic corpus describes the womb as an animal-like entity that could wander throughout the body, causing various symptoms. Treatments for wandering womb included fumigating the vagina with unpleasant smells to drive the womb downward, while placing sweet scents near the woman's head to lure it upward. Other gynecological treatments included pessaries made of wool soaked in various substances, from beneficial honey to toxic lead compounds. Divorce was asymmetrical in its application. A man could divorce by simply declaring the marriage ended and sending his wife back to her family, though he would typically have to return her dowry. A woman seeking divorce needed her male guardian to represent her and demonstrate serious cause, such as abuse or abandonment. Children always remained with the father's household after divorce, as they were considered his property rather than the product of a shared relationship. Adultery laws revealed the fundamentally unequal sexual standards. A husband's sexual activities with slaves, prostitutes, or certain categories of unmarried women were acceptable, while a wife's adultery was a serious crime potentially punishable by death. The concern was primarily about inheritance, ensuring that a man's property passed to his biological children rather than those conceived by his wife with another man. Religious life provided women with their most significant public roles and rare opportunities for authority. Female-centered cults like the Thesmophoria excluded men entirely, and priestesses of major deities could wield considerable influence. These religious spaces offered women their only sanctioned gatherings outside male supervision and became important sites for female community building and knowledge sharing. Some exceptional women managed to transcend these limitations. Aspasia, companion to Pericles, was renowned for her intelligence and said to have influenced Athenian policy, though she faced vicious slander for her public visibility. Wealthy widows sometimes achieved unusual independence if they had no close male relatives to control them. And in Sparta, women experienced somewhat greater freedom, owning property and receiving physical education, though this was primarily to produce stronger mothers for Spartan warriors, rather than from any concept of gender equality. These exceptions, however, only highlight the overwhelming restrictions most Greek women faced, a system so comprehensive that even the language used to describe respectable women emphasized their invisibility. The highest compliment for an Athenian woman was that she was not spoken of by men outside her family, either for good or ill. Her ideal existence was to remain literally unremarkable, her identity subsumed entirely within the household she maintained but did not control. Perhaps no aspect of ancient Greek society is more disturbing to modern sensibilities than their treatment of children, particularly the practice of infant exposure. This institutionalized form of infanticide, abandoning unwanted newborns to die from exposure to the elements, or to be collected by others for slavery or prostitution, was not only legal, but socially accepted across all Greek city-states. The decision to expose a child was legally the father's alone. Upon a child's birth, the infant would be presented to the father, who would then decide whether to accept it into the family. If rejected, the child would be placed in a clay pot or vessel and left at a designated location, often a garbage dump, roadside, or sacred site. Some might be taken by childless families or slave traders, but many died from exposure, starvation, or animal attacks. Multiple factors could lead to a child's rejection. Physical deformities or signs of illness were common reasons, reflecting both practical concerns about resources and religious beliefs that such children might indicate divine disfavor. Gender was another crucial factor. Female infants were exposed at significantly higher rates than males, creating serious demographic imbalances in some communities. Economic pressures also played a role, particularly for poorer families who could not afford additional children or the substantial dowries required for daughters. This practice was so normalized that it appears frequently in Greek mythology and literature without moral condemnation. The story of Oedipus begins with his exposure as an infant due to a prophecy. Stories of gods and heroes often include exposure followed by miraculous rescue. These narratives reflected the reality that exposure was not considered murder, but rather a regrettable necessity within a resource-constrained society. For the children who were accepted into families, childhood in ancient Greece was brief by modern standards. Children were viewed as physically and intellectually undeveloped adults, rather than beings with their own developmental stages requiring special treatment. Play existed, as evidenced by toys found in archaeological contexts, but formal education began early, especially for boys from citizen families. Corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach. The Greek word for education, paideia, is etymologically related to pace, child, and to strike, reflecting how central physical discipline was to their educational philosophy. Teachers and parents used leather straps, sticks, and rods to beat children for infractions or failures in learning. These beatings were not considered abuse but proper formation of character, believed necessary to overcome children's natural tendencies toward laziness and disobedience. Child labor was universal across social classes, though its form varied. Children from poor families began working alongside their parents as early as age 5 or 6, in agriculture, crafts, or as servants. Even in wealthy households, children performed household tasks as part of their training. Child slaves were particularly vulnerable, working in mines, workshops, and homes with little protection from exploitation. Sexual exploitation of children was common and largely unregulated, while formal pederasty, the institutionalized relationship between adult men and adolescent boys, had certain social rules and expectations. These provided limited protection and primarily benefited boys from elite families. Children of slaves, the poor, or those orphaned had virtually no protection from sexual predation. Girls could be legally married as young as 14, sometimes younger with parental agreement, typically to much older men, with consummation expected immediately, regardless of physical readiness for sexual activity or childbearing. Health outcomes for children were poor by modern standards. Childhood diseases that are now preventable through vaccination regularly claimed lives, and simple infections could quickly become fatal without antibiotics. Nutritional deficiencies were common, especially among the lower classes, leading to developmental issues, dental problems, and reduced resistance to disease. Archaeological evidence from children's remains shows high rates of anemia, rickets, and growth stunting. Education, while celebrated in our image of ancient Greece, was neither universal nor standardized. Only boys from citizen families typically received formal education beyond basic vocational training. This education initially focused on literacy, numeracy, music, and physical training, with more advanced rhetorical and philosophical education available only to the wealthiest. Girls received primarily domestic training within the household, learning textile production, basic household management, and sometimes elementary literacy if from an educated family. The Spartan treatment of children represents an extreme case within Greek practice. At age 7, boys were taken from their families to live in military barracks, beginning the famously harsh Agoge training system. Deliberately underfed to encourage stealing, though punished severely if caught, subjected to ritualized whipping competitions, and trained in combat from an early age, Spartan boys experienced a childhood designed to eliminate weakness and instill absolute loyalty to the state above even family ties. Religious coming-of-age rituals marked the transition from childhood to adult status, though these varied by region and gender. For Athenian boys, this included the Apatoria festival, where their hair was cut and offered to Apollo, and registration with their father's phratry, brotherhood. Girls might participate in the Arctea festival dedicated to Artemis, marking their transition toward marriage readiness rather than civic participation. The fundamental reality is that childhood in ancient Greece was characterized by vulnerability, brief duration, and often exploitation. While philosophical works like Plato's might discuss ideal education, the lived experience for most Greek children was one of early responsibility, limited protection, and development, shaped primarily by the economic needs of the family, rather than concern for individual flourishing. Slavery in ancient Greece was not peripheral, but central to both the economy and social structure. While estimates vary, in cities like Athens, slaves may have constituted between 30 to 40% of the population. Unlike the race-based slavery of more recent eras, Greek slavery was primarily a consequence of warfare, piracy, debt, and birth to enslaved parents. Anyone could potentially become a slave through the misfortunes of capture or economic disaster. The acquisition of slaves occurred through multiple channels. War provided a consistent supply, as defeated populations might be enslaved en masse. The fall of a Greek city typically meant death for adult male defenders and enslavement for women and children. Pirates operating throughout the Mediterranean specifically targeted coastal communities to capture inhabitants for slave markets. Some individuals entered slavery through debt, particularly before reforms like Solon Sysakhtheia in Athens outlawed debt bondage for citizens, though not for non-citizens. And many slaves were born into their status, inheriting their mother's enslaved condition, regardless of their father's status. Slave markets operated openly in major Greek cities. New arrivals would be stripped naked for inspection by potential buyers, who examined them for physical defects, signs of health or disease, and physical attributes suited to intended work. Dealers would loudly proclaim slaves' positive qualities while concealing defects, leading to legal protections for buyers against fraudulent sales. Protections that did nothing for the enslaved themselves. Prices varied dramatically based on skills, appearance, and origin, with educated slaves commanding higher prices than those destined for physical labor. The conditions of enslavement varied considerably depending on the slave's role and owner. Household slaves, oikotai, might develop personal relationships with their owners and enjoy better living conditions than those in agriculture or mining. Educated slaves could serve as tutors, accountants, or business managers, sometimes with considerable responsibility. At the opposite extreme, slaves in the notorious silver mines at Lorient experienced perhaps the most brutal conditions, working in narrow tunnels with minimal ventilation, sustenance, or rest, with life expectancies measured in mere years rather than decades. Legal protection for slaves was minimal. While Athens had laws prohibiting the killing of slaves, these were enforced inconsistently at best. Slaves could be beaten, sexually exploited, or tortured with few restrictions. In legal proceedings involving slaves, testimony was typically accepted only if extracted under torture, basinos, reflecting the belief that slaves would only tell the truth under duress. Slaves could not marry legally, and any children born to slave women automatically became the property of their mother's owner, regardless of the father's status. Some avenues for manumission freedom existed, though the percentages of slaves who achieved freedom were small. Particularly loyal slaves might be freed in their owner's will. Some slaves were permitted to work independently and save money to purchase their freedom, particularly those with specialized skills. During warfare, states might promise freedom to slaves willing to serve as rowers in the fleet or emergency soldiers. However, even freed slaves faced significant restrictions, typically becoming medics, resident aliens, rather than citizens, with higher tax burdens and limited legal rights. The philosophical justification for slavery reveals much about Greek society. Aristotle famously argued that some people were natural slaves, individuals whose rational faculties were allegedly underdeveloped, making them suited for direction by others. This convenient philosophy naturalized an economic system that benefited slave owners, though some sophists and later philosophers did question whether slavery could be justified by nature rather than merely by convention or law. The prevalence of slavery fundamentally shaped Greek concepts of freedom and leisure. The Greek term for leisure, skole, the root of our word school, was explicitly contrasted with unfree labor. Democratic participation, philosophical contemplation, and artistic creation. The achievements we most celebrate about Greek civilization were possible precisely because enslaved populations performed the necessary productive labor that supported these activities. This reality complicates any uncritical celebration of Greek cultural achievements, which rested on a foundation of systematic exploitation. The psychological effects of living in a slave society extended to both the enslaved and the enslavers. For slaves, the constant threat of violence, separation from family, and denial of basic autonomy created trauma that is documented even in the limited records reflecting their perspectives. For slave owners, maintaining the system required psychological distancing and dehumanization, evidenced in language that frequently compared slaves to domesticated animals, rather than recognizing their full humanity. Resistance to slavery took various forms. Runaway slaves, drapatai, were common enough that there was a standard process for recapturing them, including the use of dogs and professional slave catchers. More organized resistance occasionally occurred, though nothing on the scale of the famous Spartacus revolt in Rome. More common was day-to-day resistance through work slowdowns, feigned illness, sabotage of tools, or theft, small acts of defiance within a system that offered little opportunity for open rebellion. The institution of slavery in ancient Greece represents perhaps the starkest contradiction in a society that simultaneously developed ideas of political liberty, philosophical ethics, and human dignity. The Greek achievement, extraordinary as it was, came at the expense of an enslaved population whose labor, suffering, and dehumanization made possible the leisure required for democracy and philosophy to flourish. For ancient Greeks, war was not an occasional eruption of violence, but a persistent state of existence. The geographic fragmentation of Greece into hundreds of independent polis, city-states, created a political landscape where conflict was inevitable and nearly constant. Historical records suggest that Athens, for example, was at war more often than it was at peace throughout the classical period. Greek warfare evolved significantly over time, but certain characteristics remained consistent. Unlike modern concepts of professional military separate from civilian life, Greek armies consisted primarily of citizen soldiers who owned their own equipment. This created a direct link between military service and social status. Those wealthy enough to afford the bronze armor, shield, helmet, and weapons of a hoplite, heavy infantrymen, constituted the military backbone of most Greek states and correspondingly held greater political power. The iconic Greek phalanx formation, a densely packed rectangular array of hoplites with overlapping shields, embodied Greek cultural values as much as military tactics. Individual prowess mattered less than maintaining formation and protecting one's comrades. The left side of each warrior was protected by his neighbor's shield, creating an interdependence that emphasized collective discipline over heroic individualism. To flee from battle was not merely a personal failing, but a betrayal of one's community, resulting in profound shame and potential legal penalties. Combat itself was extraordinarily brutal by modern standards. The typical Greek battle involved phalanxes meeting head-on, with the front ranks literally pushing against each other in physical contact. The infamous odysmos, or pushing match, while stabbing with spears at exposed areas, the neck, groin, or legs below the shield. Once spears broke, fighting continued with short swords. Medical understanding was primitive, and even minor wounds frequently became infected. Battlefield injuries often resulted in permanent disability when not immediately fatal. Greek warfare followed certain conventions during the Archaic and early Classical periods. Summer campaigns to avoid disrupting agricultural cycles, set-piece battles rather than sieges, and mutually agreed-upon terms for recovering the dead. However, these conventions broke down during the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, which introduced more total warfare, including deliberate targeting of civilian populations, systematic destruction of agricultural resources, year-round campaigning, naval blockades to induce starvation, mass executions of defeated populations, as at Melos in 416 BCE, extended sieges with catastrophic humanitarian consequences. The aftermath of defeat in war could be apocalyptic for a Greek community. While practices varied, it was not uncommon for victors to execute all adult male defenders, sell women and children into slavery, and either recolonize or completely destroy the physical city. The destruction of Plataea by Sparta in 427 BCE exemplifies this pattern. The male population was systematically executed after surrender, the women enslaved, and the city razed to the ground. The constant warfare created a society permanently shaped by trauma. Orphaned children, widows with limited means of support, disabled veterans, and psychological casualties were endemic. The Greek language developed specific terminology for combat stress reactions, including panic, from the god Pan, whose presence was said to cause irrational fear. Descriptions in historical and literary texts suggest that what we would now identify as PTSD was widespread, though understood through religious and cultural frameworks rather than psychological ones. Preparation for warfare dominated male education and socialization. Boys trained in wrestling, running, and weapons handling from early ages. Public festivals frequently included militaristic competitions and displays. Religious ceremonies before battle, including animal sacrifice and divination, reinforced the concept that warfare had divine sanction. Even philosophy and literature extensively addressed warfare, whether justifying it, as in Aristotle's Politics, or depicting its horrors, as in Euripides' Trojan Women. Sparta represents the extreme case of militarization in Greek society. From age 7, Spartan boys lived in barracks rather than with their families, undergoing the agoge training system designed to produce unwavering soldiers. Spartan males remained in active military service until age 60, never developing civilian occupations. Women were likewise socialized to prioritize military values, famously told to tell departing warriors to return with their shield or on it, victorious or dead, but never having fled. This total militarization made Sparta an object of both fear and fascination for other Greeks, who recognized its martial superiority while often criticizing its cultural narrowness. Mercenary service became increasingly common during the classical and Hellenistic periods, particularly for poorer citizens who lacked hoplite equipment and for Greeks from economically marginal regions. By the 4th century BCE, large numbers of Greeks served in Persian, Egyptian, and various Greek armies far from their home cities. This professionalization of warfare gradually shifted military service from a civic obligation to an economic activity, with significant consequences for Greek political structures that had been built around citizen soldiers. The glorification of warfare permeated Greek religion, art, and literature. The Iliad, foundation of Greek literary tradition, centers on war and its consequences. Major deities like Athena and Ares had explicit martial aspects. Temple friezes and painted pottery frequently depicted battle scenes. This cultural celebration of warfare normalized violence and created powerful social incentives for male participation in combat, regardless of individual inclination. At the same time, Greek literature contains some of history's most powerful anti-war statements. Euripides' tragedies unflinchingly depict the suffering of war's victims, particularly women and children. Aristophanes' comedies like Lysistrata and Peace satirize warmongers and glorify peace. This tension between celebrating martial valor while acknowledging war's horrors runs throughout Greek cultural expression, reflecting a society that both depended on warfare for its political structure and suffered continuously from its effects. Bookmark. Score V6D2 and V3. The Greek conception of justice differed fundamentally from modern understandings. Rather than focusing on rehabilitation or proportional punishment, Greek judicial systems emphasized retribution, deterrence through spectacle, and the restoration of community harmony disrupted by criminal acts. The result was a system that was often brutal, inconsistent, and heavily influenced by social status. Athens, despite its democratic structure, lacked many elements we consider essential to fair judicial proceedings. There was no public prosecutor. Victims or their families had to bring charges themselves, creating immediate disadvantages for those without education, wealth, or powerful connections. Professional lawyers did not exist. Litigants spoke for themselves or hired speechwriters, logographers, if they could afford them. Trials were decided by large juries of male citizens with no legal training, voting immediately after hearing speeches without deliberation. Evidence rules were virtually non-existent, allowing hearsay, character assassination, and emotional appeals that would be inadmissible in modern courts. Bookmark. VQ6D2N. Torture was a standard investigative technique, particularly for slaves. The testimony of slaves was only admissible in court if obtained under torture, based on the belief that slaves would only tell truth under duress. This torture, basanos, was so normalized that litigants would offer their slaves for torture to prove their case or demand their opponent's slaves be tortured for testimony. The reliability of information obtained through such means was never seriously questioned. Bookmark. VQ6D2W3. Punishment for crimes varied dramatically by social status. Citizens generally had more protections than medics, resident foreigners, or slaves. For example, it was illegal to beat an Athenian citizen, but slaves could be whipped for minor infractions. Capital punishment for citizens often took the relatively humane form of hemlock poisoning, as in Socrates' case, while non-citizens might face more painful executions including impalement, crucifixion, or being thrown from cliffs. Bookmark. VQDU. Prison served primarily as temporary holding before trial or execution, rather than as punishment itself. The concept of incarceration as rehabilitation was entirely absent. Conditions in these holding facilities were appalling. Dark, unventilated spaces without sanitation facilities, where prisoners depended on family members to provide food or face starvation. Bookmark. VQ6D2 Exile was a common punishment that reflected the Greek view that citizenship itself was the highest good. Permanent banishment, aegia, meant not only physical removal from the polis, but complete civic death, loss of property, family connections, religious participation, and identity. Temporary exile, ostracism in Athens, was less severe, but still represented a profound punishment in a society where belonging to one's polis was central to personal identity. Bookmark. VQ6D2 and WFB3. Corporal punishment was public and intentionally humiliating. Floggings occurred in the agora, maximizing their deterrent effect through public spectacle. For slaves and sometimes non-citizen residents, branding was used to mark individuals who had attempted escape or committed serious crimes, permanently identifying them as deviant and hampering any future attempts to change their status. Bookmark, or VQ6D. Family members could be punished for the crimes of their relatives. In cases of treason, for instance, the perpetrator's entire family might be executed or banished, their property confiscated, and their house demolished, effectively erasing not just the individual, but their entire lineage from the community. This collective punishment reflected the Greek view that character and tendency toward crime were inherited, and that families shared responsibility for members' actions. Bookmark, VQ62. Greek concept of pollution, miasma, further complicated their approach to justice. Certain crimes, particularly murder, were believed to create a spiritual contamination that could spread to the entire community if not properly addressed. This religious dimension made prosecution of homicide cases a sacred duty and influenced their handling. Murder trials in Athens were held in open air so that jurors would not be contaminated by sharing a roof with the accused. Bookmark. While written law codes existed in most Greek cities by the classical period, their interpretation remained flexible and highly dependent on social factors. Juries could be swayed by the status of the litigants, their service to the city, or even the quality of their speaking voice. The famous Athenian statesman Pericles was known to remind jurors of his contributions to the city when facing charges, a tactic that would be considered highly improper in modern judicial systems, but was standard practice in Athens. Bookmark, V6. For many crimes, self-help remained the primary form of justice. A man finding an adulterer with his wife, mother, sister, or daughter was legally permitted to kill him on the spot. Theft might be addressed through private retribution rather than formal charges. This resulted in significant disparities, as those with greater resources or stronger networks could enforce their own justice more effectively than the vulnerable. Bookmark. Remarkably, despite these characteristics that seem harsh or arbitrary by modern standards, Greeks, particularly Athenians, took immense pride in their legal systems and considered fair judicial process a defining feature of civilization as opposed to barbarity. This pride coexisted with practices we would now consider fundamentally unjust, illustrating how thoroughly conceptions of justice are shaped by cultural context. Bookmark. VQ6D2. Religion in ancient Greece was not a matter of personal faith, but a civic and social obligation interwoven with every aspect of daily life. The Greek pantheon of gods, the Olympians and numerous lesser deities, were understood not as benevolent guardians but as powerful, capricious forces requiring constant propitiation to avoid disaster. Far from the sanitized versions in modern popular culture, Greek gods exhibited jealousy, rage, vengeance, and sexual predation alongside their more noble qualities. Bookmark. VQ-D2. The fundamental relationship between humans and gods was one of transaction rather than love or devotion. Sacrifices, libations, and dedicated offerings were understood as payments for divine favors or protection from divine wrath. This transactional approach created perpetual anxiety. Had one sacrificed enough or to the right deity? Had a ritual been performed correctly? A simple mistake in religious protocol could bring catastrophe not just on the individual, but on their entire community. Bookmark. V6D-EB3. Animal sacrifice formed the core of Greek religious practice. Far from the clean, symbolic rituals often depicted in art, actual Greek sacrifice was bloody, smoky, and visceral. A typical sacrifice involved leading a domesticated animal, usually a sheep, goat, or ox, to the altar, stunning it with a blow to the head, cutting its throat to drain the blood into special vessels, then butchering it with portions burned for the gods while the remainder was distributed for human consumption. Major festivals might involve hundreds of animals slaughtered in succession, creating scenes of considerable gore. Bookmark. Divine punishment was a constant fear. Greek mythology and literature abound with stories of humans suffering terrible consequences for offending deities. Actaeon torn apart by his own hunting dogs for glimpsing Artemis bathing. Niobe's children slain by Apollo and Artemis for her maternal pride. Entire cities suffering plague or famine due to religious transgressions. These narratives reinforced the terror of divine retribution and the need for scrupulous observance of religious requirements. Bookmark VQ62NDQF8B3. The concept of miasma, pollution, created further anxiety. Both physical conditions, childbirth, death, menstruation, and moral transgressions, murder, perjury, incest, were believed to create a contagious spiritual contamination that could offend the gods and spread to anyone in contact with the polluted person. Elaborate purification rituals were required to address miasma, and individuals in a state of pollution were excluded from religious spaces and activities, creating both practical hardship and social stigma. Bookmark VQ6 divination pervaded decision-making at all levels of Greek society. Before major undertakings, military campaigns, founding colonies, constructing public buildings, various forms of divination would be consulted. These included examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, hepatoscopy, observing the flight patterns of birds, interpreting dreams, or consulting oracles. Unfavorable signs could delay or prevent important activities, sometimes with significant practical consequences. Before the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, for instance, the Greeks delayed engaging the Persian fleet until favorable sacrifices were obtained. Bookmark VQ6D2 and Pavekbi oracles held particular importance, with the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi being the most renowned. Contrary to popular depictions, consulting major oracles was neither simple nor accessible to ordinary people. The process required substantial payments, preliminary sacrifices, and often political connections. At Delphi, the Pythia priestess delivered ambiguous utterances that were interpreted by male priests, creating multiple layers through which divine communication was filtered and potentially manipulated for political purposes. Bookmark VQ62NFE3. The Greek afterlife offered little comfort by comparison with later religious concepts. For most, the afterlife meant existence as a shade in the dim realm of Hades. Not a place of punishment, but a pale, joyless shadow of earthly life. The Homeric hero Achilles famously declared he would rather be a living slave than king of the dead. Exceptional punishment awaited major transgressors like Tantalus or Sisyphus, but there was no concept of paradise for the virtuous majority. Only heroes elevated to godhood escaped this dreary fate. Mystery cults emerged partly in response to this bleak afterlife conception. The Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates a better fate after death without specifying exactly what that entailed. These mystery religions, with their secret rituals and oaths of silence, offered psychological comfort unavailable in mainstream religious practice, particularly for women and others with limited access to public religious roles. Religious festivals provided a counterbalance to these anxieties, offering periods of communal celebration, temporary suspension of normal social rules, and genuine joy. The Athenian calendar included around 120 festival days annually, from the Panathenea celebrating Athena to the rural Dionysia with its theatrical performances. These festivals combined religious observance with entertainment, athletic competition, excessive consumption, and even sanctioned transgressions, creating psychological release from the strict behavioral codes of everyday life. Bookmark VQ62. Women found both restriction and opportunity in Greek religion. Barred from most forms of public participation, women nonetheless held important religious roles as priestesses, particularly for female deities. The Pythia at Delphi was always a woman, as were the priestesses of Athena on the Athenian Acropolis. Women-only festivals like the Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter, excluded men entirely, creating rare spaces for female community and temporary autonomy. Bookmark VQ62. The financial burden of religion was considerable. Beyond regular sacrifices and offerings, wealthy citizens were expected to fund religious festivals and processions through the liturgy system. Temples required constant maintenance, and major sanctuaries like Delphi or Olympia accumulated vast treasuries of dedicated objects. This religious economy redistributed significant resources while reinforcing social hierarchies, as only the wealthy could afford the most impressive demonstrations of piety. Bookmark V6DD2QB3. Despite the apparent polytheism, Greek religion showed early signs of more abstract religious concepts. Philosophical schools, particularly after Socrates, began questioning traditional religious narratives and developing more unified concepts of divinity. The pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes criticized anthropomorphic depictions of gods, while Plato's philosophy moved toward more abstract conceptions of the divine. These intellectual currents existed alongside traditional practice, rather than replacing it, creating a complex religious landscape that defies simple categorization. Bookmark VQ6. For the average Greek, religion thus represented both terror and comfort. An explanatory system for natural phenomena, a framework for community cohesion, and a source of constant anxiety. The gods were neither consistently benevolent nor malevolent, but powerful entities to be approached with caution, respect, and scrupulous attention to ritual detail. In a world where human existence was precarious and scientific explanation limited, religious practice offered a sense of agency amid uncertainty, even as it created new forms of psychological burden. Bookmark V6. The symposium holds a cherished place in our cultural imagination of ancient Greece. Intellectual men reclining on couches, engaging in philosophical discourse while sharing wine and cultural performances. This romanticized vision, while not entirely false, obscures the more troubling realities of these elite male drinking parties and their place in Greek society. Bookmark Core VQ6D23. Far from being primarily intellectual gatherings, most symposia centered on calculated intoxication. Participants drank wine mixed with water in large craters, mixing bowls, with the wine-to-water ratio determined by the symposiarch, master of the symposium. As evenings progressed, this ratio typically increased, leading to greater intoxication. Drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric, not because of concerns about drunkenness, but because it hastened intoxication beyond the carefully managed pace preferred for the full symposium experience. Sexual exploitation was built into the symposium structure. Female entertainers, flute girls, dancers, and acrobats were typically slaves or foreign women of low status who had no ability to refuse sexual advances from participants. These women might be hired for the evening specifically to provide sexual services along with entertainment, while consensual relationships with young male citizens, the famous Greek pederasty, had certain social rules and constraints. No such protections existed for these female performers, who might be passed among multiple symposium participants over the course of an evening. Bookmark V6D, violence was commonplace as intoxication increased. Greek literature and pottery depict symposiusts engaging in aggressive behavior, breaking furniture, fighting with each other, and abusing slaves and entertainers. The Katabas game, often romanticized as a playful symposium activity, involved flinging wine dregs at targets, including sometimes at slaves who could not object to being soaked with wine and exposed to mockery. More serious violence could erupt over perceived insults or romantic rivalries. Bookmark VQ6A. The symposium reinforced hierarchical social structures even among citizen participants. Seating arrangements followed strict status protocols, with more honored guests placed near the host. The quality of food, wine, and drinking vessels often varied according to a guest's importance. These material distinctions created visible reminders of social hierarchy, even in supposedly egalitarian intellectual discourse. Bookmark. Competitive elements dominated symposium activities. Drinking competitions tested physical capacity for alcohol. Poetic recitations and improvised verses were judged for quality, with failures meeting ridicule. Even philosophical discussions often took the form of competitive argumentation rather than collaborative inquiry. This competitive atmosphere created significant social pressure and anxiety for participants concerned about maintaining their status. Bookmark VQ62. The symposium's exclusionary nature reinforced social boundaries. Only free men could participate as guests, explicitly excluding women, except as servants or entertainers, slaves, and often medics, resident foreigners. Even among eligible men, financial requirements effectively limited participation to those wealthy enough to reciprocate by hosting their own symposia or contributing substantial wine donations. The symposium thus functioned as both a site and mechanism of elite male bonding that strengthened networks of privilege. Bookmark V6D2. Excessive consumption at symposia had significant health consequences. Ancient medical writings discussed the physical effects of regular intoxication, including liver damage, cognitive impairment, and sexual dysfunction. The famous Hippocratic face described in medical texts, a particular appearance indicating approaching death, includes features associated with liver failure, suggesting physicians regularly treated alcohol-related illness. However, social pressure to participate in drinking culture often outweighed health concerns. Bookmark VQ62A3. The transition from symposium to Komos, drunken procession, created public disturbance and often property damage. After the formal symposium, participants frequently took to the streets in noisy, intoxicated groups, banging on doors, harassing passersby, and sometimes committing acts of vandalism, like destroying public statues or defacing buildings. While technically illegal, these behaviors were rarely punished when perpetrated by elite young men, highlighting the uneven application of law based on social status. The symposium's glorification in philosophical texts like Plato's Symposium represents a highly idealized version that was likely exceptional rather than typical. Philosophers attempted to reclaim and elevate the symposium as an intellectual space, but archaeological and literary evidence suggests most actual symposia hewed closer to their origins as male drinking parties, where excess was the point rather than an unfortunate deviation. Bookmark U6DD3. Economic costs of maintaining symposium culture were substantial. Elite households required dedicated androns, men's rooms, with special furniture for reclining, expensive serving vessels, and storage facilities for wine. The direct costs of food and drink for a single symposium could equal a laborer's monthly wages. This conspicuous consumption contributed to economic stratification while normalizing extravagance among the upper classes. Bookmark V6D. Despite these realities, the symposium served important cultural functions. It provided a semi-private space for political networking and alliance building outside formal governmental structures. It transmitted cultural knowledge through poetry recitation and musical performance. It allowed for certain types of philosophical and political discussion that might be risky in more public settings. These benefits, however, accrued primarily to already privileged males while reinforcing their social advantages. Bookmark. The symposium thus encapsulates many of ancient Greece's contradictions. Intellectual achievement alongside exploitation, cultural refinement alongside crude excess, and community building that simultaneously reinforced exclusion. Like many Greek institutions, its legacy is complex, requiring us to acknowledge both its contributions to intellectual history and its role in sustaining social hierarchies and normative violence. Sexual customs in ancient Greece differed dramatically from modern Western norms, encompassing practices that ranged from the unfamiliar to what we would now consider explicit exploitation and abuse. Understanding these practices requires setting aside both prudish avoidance and romanticized notions of Greek sexual liberation. Marriage in ancient Greece functioned primarily as a reproductive and economic arrangement rather than a romantic or sexual partnership. Husbands and wives typically had limited emotional connection, unsurprising given that brides were usually 14 to 16 years old, while husbands were often in their 30s. Sexual relations within marriage focused on procreation, with female pleasure considered largely irrelevant. Medical texts suggest that female orgasm was recognized, but deemed unnecessary for conception, while male climax was considered essential. Bookmark VQ6D2. Extramarital sex for men was not merely tolerated, but expected. A respectable Athenian man had several sanctioned sexual outlets: his wife for reproduction, concubines, often captured foreign women for pleasure, prostitutes for variety, and sometimes younger male citizens for mentorship relationships with an erotic component. This sexual access depended entirely on the man's status rather than mutual desire. Slaves, foreigners, and women had little or no right to refuse sexual advances from citizen men. Bookmark VQ6D. Prostitution existed in various forms. Porni were the lowest class of sex workers, often slaves owned by a pornobaskos, brothel keeper, who collected their earnings. These women worked in brothels or on the street, serving primarily lower-class clients for small fees. Slightly higher in status were independent prostitutes who maintained their own dwellings. At the highest level were hetairae, companions, educated courtesans who provided intellectual conversation and artistic entertainment alongside sexual services, some of whom achieved considerable wealth and influence, despite their marginalized legal status. Bookmark VQ6D2. Regulated prostitution existed in some Greek cities. In Athens, Solon established public brothels, staffed by enslaved women, purchased by the state. These brothels charged fixed prices, affordable even to working-class men, with revenues contributing to the city treasury. This institutionalization of sexual slavery reflects how thoroughly the exploitation of vulnerable bodies was integrated into the civic structure. Bookmark VQ6D. Pederasty, sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, was institutionalized and regulated by social custom rather than prohibited. Typically, an arestes, adult man, would court an eromenos, adolescent boy from a citizen family, offering gifts, mentorship, and social connections. Physical relations were expected to follow certain protocols. The youth was not supposed to show direct pleasure, The adult partner was expected to show restraint, and penetration might be avoided in favor of intercrural sex between the thighs. These relationships were temporary, ending when the youth grew a full beard and transitioned to adult status. Bookmark. While some historical revisionists have attempted to portray these relationships as primarily educational or non-sexual, abundant evidence from Greek vase paintings, poetry, and legal speeches confirms their sexual nature. The power imbalance inherent in these relationships, involving adolescents as young as 12 to 14, makes them clearly problematic by modern ethical and legal standards, regardless of their cultural normalization in ancient contexts. Bookmark. Consent as we understand it had limited relevance in Greek sexual ethics. The primary distinctions concerned status and role rather than willing participation. Sexual violence against slaves, foreign residents, and prostitutes was rarely punished. Even for citizens, the concept of sexual consent applied primarily to questions of who had authority over an individual's sexuality rather than personal choice. A father or husband's rights could be violated by sexual acts, regardless of the wishes of the person actually involved. Bookmark. VQ. Rape of female citizens was treated primarily as a property crime against the woman's male guardian, rather than a violation of the woman herself. Penalties could be severe, but prosecution required the action of the woman's kurios, male guardian, and the woman's testimony was considered secondary if admissible at all. Forced sexual acts against males could be prosecuted under laws against hubris, outrage, focusing on the status violation rather than sexual autonomy. Bookmark. Sick. Sexual acts carried complex implications for social status. The active or penetrative role was associated with masculinity, dominance, and citizenship, while the passive or receptive role implied submission and potential loss of status for adult men. This conceptual framework meant that adult male citizens who willingly took receptive roles faced significant social stigma, potentially including loss of citizen rights for prostituting themselves. Sex was thus inseparable from broader social hierarchies. Bookmark. Sexual vocabulary in Greek was explicit and varied, with detailed terminology for specific acts that appears in everything from medical texts to comic plays. Greek comedy, in particular, featured abundant sexual humor that would be considered graphic by modern standards, indicating that public sexual discourse was less restricted than in many later periods. This verbal openness coexisted with certain forms of physical modesty. Athletes competed nude, but adult men typically kept their genitals covered by a posture or garment in social settings. Bookmark. VQ. Non-reproductive sexual practices were common and discussed in medical and philosophical texts. Greek medical writers cataloged various sexual positions, acts, and their supposed health effects. Contraceptive methods, including herbal preparations, rhythm methods, and primitive barriers, were widely used, particularly with non-marital partners. Abortion, while not legally prohibited, carried religious pollution concerns and significant health risks given the primitive methods available. Bookmark. 6D and UF. Same-sex relations between women are less documented but clearly existed. Sappho's poetry from Lesbos provides the most famous evidence of emotional and physical relationships between women, though the precise nature of these relationships continues to be debated by scholars. Given women's limited literacy and restricted public voices, the historical record likely captures only a fraction of female same-sex experiences. Bookmark. Feast due to the FB. Sexual double standards were extreme even by the measure of later periods. A wife's adultery could result in mandatory divorce, loss of dowry, and religious exclusion, while her husband faced no consequences for relations with unmarried women or slaves. A woman's sexual reputation affected not only her own status but that of her entire family, creating intense social pressure for female sexual restraint and seclusion. The Greek sexual system thus combined elements that might seem contradictory to modern observers. Institutional exploitation alongside philosophical discussions of desire, rigid gender hierarchies alongside acknowledgement of diverse sexual practices, and public sexual discourse alongside strict regulation of certain individual sexuality. This complex system served primarily to reinforce existing social hierarchies while providing sexual access and pleasure predominantly to elite males. Bookmark. Life in an ancient Greek city assaulted the senses in ways modern visitors to carefully preserved archaeological sites can scarcely imagine. The romantic vision of gleaming marble buildings and orderly streets bears little resemblance to the chaotic, malodorous, and densely crowded reality of Greek urban centers. The physical layout of most Greek cities developed organically, rather than through planning, resulting in narrow, winding streets barely wide enough for a loaded donkey to pass. Even in cities like Athens, streets were rarely paved except near important public buildings. During dry periods, pedestrians contended with choking dust. During rains, streets transformed into muddy channels carrying refuse and waste. Without public lighting, nighttime navigation of these treacherous pathways required carrying one's own lamp or torch, making evening travel hazardous and contributing to the restriction of respectable women to daylight activities. Sanitation infrastructure was primitive at best. Most Greek cities lacked comprehensive sewage systems, relying instead on cesspits for some homes, while many residents simply emptied chamber pots into the streets. In Athens, the Eridanos River effectively functioned as an open sewer. The combination of human waste, animal dung from draft animals, discarded food, and workshop refuse created an overwhelming stench, particularly during summer months. Urban residents became desensitized to these odors, but visitors frequently commented on the assault to their senses upon entering cities. Bookmark 6D2 Waste management was minimal. While some cities had designated areas for garbage disposal outside the walls, much refuse accumulated within residential areas. Archaeological excavations of ancient neighborhoods reveal layers of compacted household waste, broken pottery, food remains, discarded items that gradually raise street levels over time, sometimes requiring home entrances to be rebuilt higher. Animal carcasses might be removed by tanners for their hides, but other processing or disposal was inconsistent. Vermin thrived in these conditions. Rats, mice, cockroaches, flies, lice, and fleas infected homes and public spaces alike. These pests served as vectors for diseases, including plague, typhus, and typhoid fever, contributing to regular epidemics. Archaeological evidence shows that intestinal parasites like roundworm and tapeworm were nearly universal among urban populations due to contaminated food and water. Bookmark Goro VQ6D2B. Water supply varied dramatically between cities and neighborhoods. While some cities developed sophisticated aqueduct systems by the Hellenistic period, many relied on wells, cisterns that collected rainwater, and natural springs, all vulnerable to contamination. Public fountains existed but were often insufficient for population needs, resulting in long waits and occasional conflicts. Water carriers, often slaves or poor women, transported water to homes lacking private wells, adding significant labor costs to daily living. Bookmark Noise pollution was constant. Without modern building materials to dampen sound, urban residents heard their neighbors' domestic activities. Workshops operated from dawn until dusk with metalworking, woodworking, and pottery production, creating constant clamor. Street vendors called out their wares, animals contributed their sounds, and religious processions with musical instruments regularly passed through neighborhoods. Privacy in the modern sense was virtually non-existent. Bookmark. Fire presented an ongoing threat, with structures built primarily of wood and other flammable materials, cooking fires inside homes, and oil lamps used for lighting. Accidental fires frequently broke out. Greek cities lacked professional firefighting forces. Neighbors formed bucket chains to combat blazes, often unsuccessfully. Major fires could destroy entire neighborhoods before being contained, and rebuilding fell entirely to individual homeowners without government assistance. Bookmark. VQ 6. Housing quality varied dramatically by social class. Wealthy citizens might enjoy spacious courtyard houses with multiple rooms, private wells, painted walls, and mosaic floors. Most urban residents, however, lived in cramped, multi-story apartment buildings with shared courtyards and facilities. The poorest inhabitants occupied single rooms, sometimes shared by entire families, with minimal ventilation and light. Construction quality was often poor, with building collapses mentioned in various texts as regular occurrences. Bookmark. Urban density created social friction. In Athens, multiple families might share a single water source, creating conflicts over access and use. Noise complaints appear in legal speeches, suggesting that disturbances from neighbors formed a common source of litigation. Workshop activities like tanning and metalworking generated complaints about odors and pollution. These conflicts had limited legal remedies, as Greek cities lacked comprehensive zoning or nuisance laws. Bookmark. Fu6D23. Markets formed the commercial and social centers of Greek cities, but were hardly the orderly marketplaces depicted in idealized reconstructions. Vendors competed aggressively for space and customers, shouting their wares and quality claims. Food fraud was common, with sellers misrepresenting products or using deceptive weights. While market officials, agoranomoi, attempted to regulate commercial activities, their effectiveness varied considerably, and bribery was endemic. Bookmark. VQ6D. Urban security was primarily self-organized rather than state-provided. Homes featured strong doors with sophisticated locks, reflecting legitimate concerns about theft. Wealthy households employed slaves as doorkeepers to control access. Night watchmen existed in some cities, but primarily protected public buildings rather than providing general security. Urban residents typically carried weapons for self-defense when traveling after dark, and groups like organized thieves and gangs of aristocratic youths engaged in violent street theater posed genuine threats to safety. Bookmark. VQ66D2. Despite these challenging conditions, cities offered compensations that continued to attract migrants from rural areas. Economic opportunities, access to imported goods, entertainment, including theatrical performances and athletic competitions, religious festivals with public feasting, and a sense of participation in a broader community. The magnetic pull of urban centers, despite their squalor and difficulties, represented a recognizable pattern that would continue throughout history into our own urbanized world. Bookmark. VQ60. While our historical focus often centers on urban achievements in philosophy, art, and politics, approximately 80 to 90% of the ancient Greek population lived in rural settings, engaging primarily in agricultural production. This rural majority experienced a reality far removed from the intellectual debates of Athens or the artistic developments of urban centers. Bookmark. VQ6D2. The typical Greek farm was small by modern standards, often just 4 to 5 hectares, roughly 10 to 12 acres. These modest plots resulted from Greece's limited arable land, inheritance customs that divided property among sons, and the practical limitations of working land without mechanization. Even wealthy landowners rarely possessed more than 20 to 30 hectares unless they were exceptional elites. Most farmers worked land barely sufficient for subsistence, with little margin for crop failure or other disasters. Bookmark VQ6DV3. Agricultural technology remained primitive throughout the ancient Greek period. The basic plow was wooden with an iron-tipped share that merely scratched the soil rather than turning it over. Drawn by oxen when available or human power when not, these plows required multiple passes over the same ground to prepare it adequately for planting. Harvesting relied on simple iron sickles, with grain threshed by having animals walk over it on a threshing floor, then winnowed by tossing it into the wind to separate chaff from grain. These methods demanded intense physical labor with minimal mechanical advantage. The Mediterranean climate imposed a strict agricultural calendar that dominated rural life. Plowing and planting occurred with the autumn rains, requiring all available household labor to prepare fields quickly during the narrow optimal planting window. Spring brought weeding and maintenance. Summer, the critical harvest period, when a delay of even a few days could mean significant crop loss. Winter was spent repairing tools, processing crops for storage, and maintaining structures. This cycle allowed minimal downtime and required careful planning around seasonal labor demands. Bookmark V6D2BF. Crop diversity provided some insurance against total failure. The typical Greek farm practiced polyculture rather than monocropping, growing a combination of grains, primarily barley, which tolerated the Greek climate better than wheat, legumes for both human consumption and soil enrichment, vegetables in garden plots, and tree crops, including olives, figs, and grapes. This diversity reduced vulnerability to crop-specific diseases or pests, but required diverse knowledge and more complex management than specialized production. Bookmark VQ6DNUB3. Olive cultivation exemplifies the long-term investment and intergenerational thinking required in Greek agriculture. Olive trees take 15 to 20 years to reach productive maturity, but can then produce for centuries with proper care. The decision to plant olive trees represented a commitment to future generations rather than immediate returns. The biennial bearing pattern of olives, heavy production one year, lighter the next, further complicated agricultural planning and storage needs. Processing olives required specialized equipment, including presses that represented significant capital investment for communities. Bookmark VQ6D. Animal husbandry complemented crop production. Most small farms maintained a few animals, perhaps a pair of oxen for plowing, some goats or sheep for milk and wool, pigs for meat, and chickens for eggs. These animals provided critical protein sources, draft power, and manure for fertilizer, but also competed with humans for resources, particularly during drought periods when fodder became scarce. Decisions about when to slaughter animals versus maintaining them for production represented complex calculations, balancing immediate needs against long-term productivity. Bookmark VQ2 Evidence. Transhumanism, the seasonal movement of livestock between elevations, characterized animal husbandry in many Greek regions. Shepherds would lead flocks to mountain pastures during summer months when lowland vegetation withered, returning to lower elevations for winter. This practice often separated male family members from households for extended periods, and created tensions between agricultural communities and pastoral groups as they competed for land use. Bookmark ScoreView 6D2. Land tenure arrangements varied considerably. While the ideal was the citizen farmer, working his own land. Reality included various forms of tenancy, sharecropping, and debt bondage. Tenant farmers typically owed half or more of their production to landowners, creating precarious economic situations where a single poor harvest could lead to insurmountable debt. In some regions, particularly those with concentrated land ownership, rural workers functioned as an agricultural proletariat, working land they would never own for subsistence wages. Bookmark. Water management presented constant challenges. Dependent primarily on rainfall rather than irrigation in most regions, Greek agriculture was vulnerable to drought. Various water management techniques developed, including terracing to prevent erosion and capture rainfall, small-scale irrigation where springs or streams allowed, and careful selection of crops appropriate to moisture conditions. Disputes over water rights feature prominently in records of rural legal conflicts, indicating the critical importance of this resource. Bookmark V62. Storage technology directly impacted food security. Grain had to be kept dry and protected from rodents and insects. Wine required careful fermentation management. Olive oil needed protection from light and air. Pithos jars, large ceramic storage containers, served for liquids and some dry goods, while specially constructed granaries with raised floors protected grain supplies. Despite these measures, post-harvest losses to pests and spoilage regularly claimed 10 to 30% of production, a devastating toll for families living near subsistence levels. Rural social structures centered on the oikos household, rather than the individual. The household included family members but also potentially slaves, resident workers, and even animals, all under the authority of the male head, Kyrios. Work was distributed according to gender and age. Men typically handled plowing, digging, and heavy field labor. Women managed food processing, textile production, child rearing, and smaller livestock. Children contributed according to their capabilities from early ages. This arrangement created interdependence that provided some security, but also meant that illness or death of key household members could create labor crises. Bookmark VQQ6. The isolation of rural life had significant implications. Scattered farmsteads and small villages had limited access to markets, medical care, or educational opportunities. Religious practice often centered on local shrines and household rituals, rather than the elaborate civic cults of urban centers. Information traveled slowly, leaving rural populations vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation by more connected elites. This isolation contributed to cultural conservatism, with rural areas maintaining traditional practices and beliefs long after urban populations had abandoned them. Bookmark VQ610. Vulnerability to external threats shaped rural experience. Unlike urban dwellers protected by city walls, rural households faced direct exposure to raiding and warfare. A common tactic in Greek warfare involved destroying enemy crops and agricultural infrastructure, knowing the devastating impact on civilian populations. During conflicts, rural residents often abandoned their homes temporarily to shelter within city walls, returning to find fields burned, olive trees cut down, representing decades of lost productivity, and storage facilities looted. These cyclical destructions contributed to the precarious nature of rural existence, despite the fertility of well-managed land. Bookmark it. The economic reality for most ancient Greeks was one of persistent precarity, living perpetually on the edge of disaster with minimal safety nets. This fundamental insecurity shaped everything from family planning to political allegiances to religious practices. Bookmark. Income inequality in Greek society was extreme by any standard. While precise Gini coefficients cannot be calculated from available evidence, estimates suggest wealth distribution was highly skewed, with perhaps 5% of the population controlling 30 to 40% of total wealth in typical polis. At Athens during the 4th century BCE, the wealthiest 300 families, less than 1% of the citizen population, possessed enough wealth to fund naval villas and major festivals through the liturgy system, while thousands of citizens subsisted through daily labor with no property beyond minimal household goods. For ordinary Greeks, financial reserves were virtually non-existent. Archaeological evidence from modest homes reveals few valuable possessions that could be liquidated in emergencies. Most families lived essentially paycheck to paycheck in modern terms, with income barely covering necessities. A health crisis, temporary unemployment, or requirement to pay a special tax could immediately push households into debt or force the sale of crucial productive assets like tools or land. Bookmark. Debt functioned as both a survival mechanism and a path to servitude. Interest rates in ancient Greece typically ranged from 12 to 18% annually, with higher rates for unsecured loans, rates that virtually guaranteed many borrowers would be unable to repay. Before Solon's reforms in Athens, debt could lead directly to enslavement of the borrower or family members. Even after such reforms, defaulting on loans resulted in loss of land, tools, or other assets essential for economic independence, effectively creating a class of dependent laborers working land they once owned. Bookmark 6D. The banking infrastructure was rudimentary and primarily served the wealthy. Trapezitai, literally table men, referring to the tables where they conducted business, accepted deposits, made loans, and sometimes offered letters of credit that facilitated long-distance trade. However, these services remained inaccessible to ordinary citizens, who relied instead on personal networks, neighborhood moneylenders charging exorbitant rates, or temples that sometimes provided loans from their treasuries. The absence of affordable credit meant that economic shocks couldn't be smoothed through borrowing without risking permanent damage to a family's economic position. Occupational hazards created additional precarity. For fishermen, shipwreck or capsizing meant not only risk of death, but loss of essential equipment. Craftsmen faced risks from workplace accidents that could permanently impair their ability to practice their trade, with no disability support systems. Farmers could lose entire harvests to weather events, plant diseases, or insect infestations. These occupation-specific risks compounded the general economic vulnerability experienced by most households. Bookmark VQD. Taxation, while not approaching modern levels, still created significant burdens for marginal households. Beyond direct taxation, which varied considerably between polis, citizens faced numerous indirect financial obligations. These included contributing to religious festivals, providing equipment for military service, paying court fees to pursue justice, and various special levies imposed during crises. Unlike progressive modern tax systems, many of these burdens fell equally on citizens regardless of means, creating disproportionate pressure on poorer households. Bookmark. The demographic reality of high mortality further destabilized household economics. With average life expectancy around 35 to 40 years, heavily skewed by high infant mortality, many households lost primary income earners in their productive prime. Widows faced particular economic vulnerability, often forced to return to natal families or accept remarriage on unfavorable terms. Orphaned children might see family resources depleted by guardians before reaching adulthood. These demographic pressures meant that even households that achieved temporary stability remained vulnerable to sudden collapse. Bookmark VQ66D. Economic opportunities were tightly constrained by status. Citizens, medics, resident foreigners, freedmen, and slaves had legally defined economic roles with varying restrictions. In Athens, for instance, medics paid special taxes, could not own land, and were excluded from certain professions, despite sometimes possessing significant skills and capital. Women faced severe limitations on independent economic activity across all status categories. These constraints prevented efficient allocation of human capital and limited social mobility, trapping many in economic positions regardless of their capabilities. Bookmark VQ62. Price volatility for essentials created chronic instability. Without modern transportation networks or storage technologies, local shortages could cause dramatic price spikes. Historical records document grain price fluctuations of 300 to 400% during shortage periods, rendering staple foods suddenly unaffordable for ordinary families. Cities attempted to mitigate these fluctuations through grain storage programs and import arrangements, but these primarily protected urban populations, leaving rural areas fully exposed to market volatility. Bookmark VQ60T. The liturgy system, whereby wealthy citizens funded public works, festivals, and military expenses, substituted for systematic taxation of wealth but created unpredictable burdens even for the affluent. A wealthy citizen might suddenly be assigned a trierarchy, responsibility for outfitting and maintaining a naval vessel, requiring substantial unplanned expenditure. This system prevented consistent public financial planning and made public services dependent on individual wealth rather than collective resources. Bookmark VQ60. Physical currency itself presented challenges. Coinage was relatively scarce at the household level, with many families having little regular access to cash. Various city-states produced their own currencies with different weights, compositions, and values, complicating trade beyond local markets. Counterfeit coins circulated widely, creating additional risk in transactions. For substantial purchases, coins needed to be weighed rather than simply counted, adding transaction costs to larger economic activities. Bookmark VQ60. Against this backdrop of general precarity, various coping mechanisms evolved. Extended family networks pooled resources and distributed risk across more individuals. Voluntary associations, Aranoi, collected regular small contributions from members to create emergency funds available for major expenses like ransoming captured relatives or funding funerals. Multiple skill development became common. Farmers typically practiced secondary crafts during agricultural off-seasons, while urban workers maintained flexibility to shift between occupations as opportunities fluctuated. Bookmark heavy. The economic precarity experienced by most Greeks directly influenced political developments. Demands for land redistribution, debt cancellation, and protection from creditors repeatedly emerged in Greek political discourse. Ambitious individuals seeking tyrannical power often built their base by promising economic reforms that would relieve the precarious circumstances of the majority. The relative stability of Athenian democracy during its height coincided with economic policies that provided some relief for poorer citizens, including paid jury service, assembly attendance pay, and public employment on construction projects. This persistent economic instability created a society where very few could take their position for granted. Even the wealthy lived with the knowledge that political reversals, war, or a few bad decisions could erase generations of accumulated wealth. For the vast majority, daily life was an ongoing calculation of resources, risks, and uncertain futures, a reality far removed from the philosophical leisure celebrated in our romantic view of ancient Greek civilization. Bookmark VQ60 Intellectual Achievements of Ancient Greece. Philosophy, mathematics, drama, political theory form the aspect of their civilization most celebrated in modern times. Yet these remarkable developments came with costs and contradictions that are frequently overlooked in our admiration for Greek thought. Greek intellectual culture was extraordinarily exclusive. Literacy itself was limited to perhaps 10 to 15% of the population, predominantly wealthy males. Even among the literate, advanced education was accessible only to those with sufficient resources to pay teachers and, more importantly, the leisure time to pursue non-productive intellectual activities. The philosophical schools we revere were explicitly designed as enclaves for the privileged few rather than institutions for broadly advancing knowledge. Bookmark VQ6D2. The economic foundation for Greek intellectual achievement rested directly on exploitation. The leisure required for philosophical contemplation was made possible by agricultural surpluses produced through slave labor and the extraction of tributes from subject communities. When Aristotle defended slavery as natural and necessary, he was protecting not merely an abstract institution, but the specific economic arrangement that made his own intellectual life possible. This connection between exploitation and intellectual freedom was not incidental, but structural. Bookmark. Women's exclusion from intellectual life represents perhaps the greatest waste of human potential in Greek society. With few exceptions, like the poet Sappho or the Pythagorean philosopher Theano, women were denied education beyond practical household management. Plato's radical suggestion in the Republic that some women might be capable of philosophical thought remained theoretical rather than implemented. This exclusion effectively silenced half the population, limiting the perspectives and experiences that could contribute to Greek intellectual development. Bookmark VQ6DT. The celebrated Greek educational system, paideia, was explicitly designed to reinforce existing social hierarchies, rather than promote critical examination of those structures. Young elite men learned to perform their class status through distinctive speech patterns, physical bearing, and intellectual references that marked them as members of the ruling class. Education functioned as much to distinguish the elite from the masses as to develop individual potential, a socialization process preparing privileged youth to accept their right to rule as natural rather than contingent. Even at its most innovative, Greek thought remained constrained by cultural assumptions that limited its development. Aristotle's biology, for instance, was hampered by Greek cultural beliefs about female inferiority that prevented him from accurately understanding reproduction despite his empirical approach. Greek mathematics, while sophisticated in geometry, was limited by a numerical notation system ill-suited to advanced calculation and conceptual development. These limitations remind us that even the most brilliant thinkers remain embedded in cultural contexts that shape what questions they can effectively ask. Bookmark VQ6D. The celebrated Greek tradition of debate and intellectual contest had darker dimensions as well. The development of rhetoric, particularly as taught by sophists, focused often on persuasive technique rather than pursuit of truth. The ability to make the weaker argument appear stronger, as critics charged, served those with power rather than those with legitimate grievances. Socrates' challenges to this approach ultimately led to his execution, demonstrating the very real dangers of intellectual inquiry that threatened established interests. Bookmark VQ6. For those excluded from formal intellectual communities, Alternative knowledge systems developed but received little historical documentation or respect. Healing practices developed by midwives, agricultural techniques refined by farmers, and craft knowledge advanced by artisans all constituted sophisticated intellectual traditions that rarely entered written records, dominated by elite perspectives. Our picture of Greek intellectual achievement thus remains skewed toward the types of knowledge valued by those with the power to record and transmit their priorities. Bookmark. The relationship between Greek intellectuals and political power was deeply problematic. Plato's disastrous attempt to implement his philosophical ideas through advising the tyrant Dionysius in Syracuse represents only the most famous example of Greek philosophers' willingness to collaborate with authoritarian rulers. Aristotle's tutelage of Alexander the Great, who would go on to conquer and subjugate numerous peoples, raises persistent questions about the ethical responsibility of intellectuals for the actions of their political patrons. Bookmark. VQ6D. The Greek intellectual tradition also contained internal contradictions that remain instructive. While celebrating rational inquiry, Greek thinkers simultaneously embraced various forms of mysticism, divination, and supernatural explanation. Socrates claimed guidance from his personal daimonion, divine sign, while Pythagoras combined mathematical innovation with religious mysticism. These contradictions remind us that the path toward rational understanding has never been linear or uncomplicated, even for those we celebrate as founders of rational tradition. Bookmark. Perhaps most importantly, Greek intellectual culture, despite its emphasis on reasoned argument, failed to effectively challenge the most profound injustices of its society. With notable exceptions like the Cynics, who rejected social conventions entirely, most Greek intellectual traditions accommodated themselves to slavery, imperialism, misogyny, and extreme inequality, rather than mounting fundamental challenges to these institutions. Philosophy provided tools for enduring unjust social arrangements, particularly Stoicism, more often than frameworks for transforming them. This recognition does not diminish genuine Greek intellectual achievements, which remain remarkable. Rather, it contextualizes these developments within the social structures that both enabled and limited them. The Greek intellectual tradition demonstrates how extraordinary insight can coexist with profound blind spots, and how the pursuit of knowledge can be simultaneously liberating and complicit in oppression, contradictions that persist in intellectual communities to the present day. Bookmark. Greeks. Modern societies generally provide institutional support for vulnerable members through public welfare systems, private charity, or some combination. Ancient Greece largely lacked such formalized support structures, creating particularly harsh conditions for the elderly, chronically ill, and those with disabilities. Bookmark. Aging in ancient Greece brought rapid physical decline by modern standards. Without modern medicine, nutrition, or dental care, people experienced accelerated deterioration of physical capabilities. Arthritis, vision problems, hearing loss, and other conditions we now manage effectively became severely debilitating. The average life expectancy at birth was approximately 35 to 40 years, though those surviving childhood could often reach their 60s. However, these additional years frequently involved significant suffering and dependency. Bookmark. VQ6. For elderly citizens with adult children, traditional obligations provided some security. Adult children, particularly sons, were legally and culturally obligated to support aging parents. This obligation was sufficiently important that candidates for public office in Athens were questioned about their treatment of parents with neglect potentially disqualifying them from service. However, this system obviously failed elderly individuals without surviving children, or whose children were unwilling or unable to fulfill their obligations. Bookmark VQ6. No pension systems or retirement provisions existed for most occupations. Physical laborers worked until they became physically incapable, at which point they faced sudden income loss. Some craft workers could transition to less demanding aspects of their trade as they aged, but many had no alternative but to continue full labor despite declining capacity. The resulting injuries and accelerated deterioration created a vicious cycle of disability and poverty. Bookmark VQ6D2. Unlimited institutional supports existed for specific groups. In Athens, the disabled who could not work and possessed less than 3 minae of property, a modest amount, could receive a small state stipend after examination by the council. War veterans with disabilities sometimes received similar support, recognizing their sacrifice for the community. However, these programs were limited in scope and coverage, and similar provisions may not have existed in other polis. Bookmark. For the elderly without family support or sufficient resources, begging became the only option for survival. Greek cities contained significant populations of elderly beggars, particularly women who had outlived male relatives and lacked the physical strength for most available labor. These individuals typically lacked stable shelter, adequate nutrition, or medical care, resulting in painful final years exposed to the elements and dependent on inconsistent charity. Disability in Greek society carried significant stigma beyond its practical challenges. Physical perfection was highly valued, with Greek art and literature celebrating idealized human forms. Various disabilities were interpreted as divine punishment or omens of divine displeasure. In Sparta, the infamous practice of exposing infants with visible congenital disabilities reflected this stigmatization at its most extreme. But similar attitudes persisted throughout Greek society. Bookmark VQ6D. Intellectual and developmental disabilities received little accommodation or understanding. While some recognized categories of mental illness might receive rudimentary treatment, conditions like cognitive disabilities or autism spectrum disorders, in modern terminology, were not distinctly understood. Individuals with these conditions likely faced ridicule, abuse, or exclusion from community participation, with families bearing complete responsibility for their care and protection. Bookmark. Chronic illnesses presented particular challenges. Without effective treatments for conditions like epilepsy, inflammatory diseases, or respiratory ailments, affected individuals experienced progressive deterioration with minimal palliative care. Religious healing sanctuaries like the Asclepians offered hope to some sufferers, combining religious rituals with practical measures like rest, improved diet, and basic hygiene. However, these sanctuaries were inaccessible to many due to distance, cost, or mobility limitations. Bookmark V6D2. Mobility impairments in a society built without accessibility considerations created nearly insurmountable challenges. Greek cities featured steep, narrow streets, multi-story buildings, and numerous stairs without ramps or alternative access. Public buildings and temples typically required climbing steps for entry. Transportation options were limited to walking, riding animals, or being carried by others. These barriers effectively imprisoned many individuals with mobility impairments within their homes or immediate neighborhoods. Bookmark. VQ6D2 HEDIC technology existed, but was primitive and available only to the wealthy. Archaeological and literary evidence confirms the use of wooden legs, crutches, and other basic mobility aids. Dental prosthetics using gold wire to attach replacement teeth have been found in some burials. However, these devices were costly, custom-made, and of limited functionality compared to modern assistive technology. Bookmark. Visual and hearing impairments created particular vulnerability in a society where these senses were critical for avoiding physical dangers and participating in community life. Without corrective lenses, many individuals experienced progressive vision loss that prevented reading, craft work, or safe independent navigation. Hearing loss isolated individuals from public discourse, religious ceremonies, and everyday communication in a primarily oral culture. Few accommodations existed for either condition. Bookmark. The elderly and disabled faced heightened vulnerability during crises. When cities came under siege, those with limited mobility might be unable to reach safety behind city walls. During food shortages, those unable to stand in distribution lines or physically compete for resources suffered disproportionately. Their reduced social value in a society that prized military and economic contribution meant they were often last to receive assistance when resources became scarce. Bookmark. Some Greek philosophical traditions did advocate for more humane treatment of vulnerable individuals. The Hippocratic medical tradition emphasized treating all patients regardless of status or prognosis. Aristotle's concept of human flourishing allowed for different manifestations appropriate to individual capacity. These perspectives, however, remained primarily theoretical rather than translating into broad social practice. Bookmark. Q6. This harsh reality for vulnerable populations reveals the limitations of Greek communal values in practice. While Greek political theory emphasized the community over the individual, this rarely extended to sacrificing significant resources to support those who could not contribute economically or militarily. The elderly, disabled, and chronically ill existed largely at the periphery of Greek society. Physically present but socially marginalized, their experiences rarely recorded, and their needs subordinated to those considered more valuable to the community. Bookmark. VQC. Greek cities, particularly commercial centers like Athens and Corinth, contained substantial populations of non-citizen residents called metics, metoikoi. These foreign residents, sometimes comprising 25 to 30% of the free population, occupied a complex middle status, neither citizens with full rights nor slaves without rights, but a distinct legal category with specific limitations and obligations. Bookmark. Succeed. Metics came from diverse origins. Some were former slaves who had been freed but not granted citizenship. Others were refugees from political conflicts or natural disasters in their home communities. Many were economic migrants drawn by opportunities in thriving commercial centers. Still others were craftspeople specifically recruited for their skills. This diversity created metic communities with varied backgrounds, resources, and motivations, united primarily by their shared exclusion from citizenship. Bookmark. VQ6D. The legal disabilities faced by metics were substantial. In Athens, they could not own land or buildings, a significant restriction in an agrarian society where real estate represented the most stable form of wealth. They could not marry citizens legally, with any children from mixed relationships inheriting the lesser status. They had no direct access to courts, requiring a citizen sponsor, prostates, to represent them in legal matters. Most significantly, they had no political rights, no vote in the assembly, no eligibility for office, and no direct voice in policies that governed their lives. Bookmark. VQ6. Taxation fell more heavily on metics than citizens. In addition to the taxes citizens paid, metics were required to pay a special poll tax called the metoikion. In Athens, this amounted to 12 drachmas annually for men and 6 for independent women, roughly equivalent to 2 weeks' wages for a skilled laborer. During festivals, medics had specific required contributions beyond those expected from citizens. During wartime, special tax levies, eisphori, fell disproportionately on wealthy medics compared to citizens of equivalent wealth. Bookmark VQXD2. Military service obligations created another asymmetry. Medics were required to serve in the military, particularly in the Navy, or as lightly armed troops, risking their lives for a community in which they held limited stake. Unlike citizens, whose military service translated into political rights, medics gained no additional privileges regardless of their service record, except in rare cases where extraordinary contribution might be rewarded with citizenship by special decree. Bookmark E. Despite these limitations, medics played crucial economic roles. Many specialized crafts in Athens were dominated by medic artisans, including shield making, furniture production, and luxury goods manufacturing. Banking and maritime trade featured prominent medic participants, some of whom accumulated substantial wealth despite property restrictions, typically by having citizen business partners who legally owned real estate. The famous Athenian silver mines at Laurion were largely operated by medics who leased mining concessions from the state. Bookmark VQ6D. Religious participation offered medics their most significant avenue for community integration. While excluded from certain cults, medics could participate in major festivals like the Panathenaea and Dionysia, though often in designated roles that highlighted their non-citizen status. Some deities, particularly those associated with foreign origins themselves, like Bendis, Thracian, or Adonis, Phoenician, had cult centers where medics played leading roles, creating religious spaces where their cultural traditions received recognition. Bookmark. Housing patterns reflected medics' intermediate status. Unable to own property, medics typically lived in rented accommodations, often concentrated in certain districts like Piraeus Port, or near manufacturing centers where they worked. Wealthy medics might rent entire houses, while those of modest means occupied rooms in multiple occupancy buildings. These housing patterns created neighborhoods with distinct multicultural character, where languages, culinary traditions, and customs from across the Mediterranean mingled. Bookmark. The vulnerability of medics became particularly apparent during crises. During food shortages, citizens received priority access to grain distributions. Political upheavals sometimes targeted medic communities for violence or expulsion, as occurred during the rule of the 30 tyrants in Athens, 404 to 403 BCE, when many wealthy medics were executed and their property seized. Without the protection of citizen kin networks, medics depended heavily on the stability of legal institutions that could be compromised during political turmoil. Bookmark VQ6D2N Play. Cultural contributions by medics significantly shaped Greek society, despite their marginalized status. The philosophers Aristotle and Theophrastus were medics in Athens. Numerous tragic and comic poets with medic status contributed to Athenian dramatic festivals. Craftspeople from foreign traditions introduced new techniques and aesthetic elements that were incorporated into Greek material culture. These contributions highlight the intellectual and cultural loss created by excluding medics from full participation. Bookmark VQ6D. The possibility of citizenship remained tantalizingly available, but rarely granted. Athens and other cities occasionally offered mass citizenship to medics during extreme circumstances, particularly when military manpower was desperately needed. Individual grants of citizenship for extraordinary service occurred, but required special assembly votes and religious ceremonies to incorporate the new citizen into the community's sacred identity. These exceptional cases underscored the general rule of exclusion while maintaining the theoretical possibility of incorporation. Bookmark. Women who were medics faced compounded disadvantages. Like citizen women, they had limited legal rights and economic opportunities, but without the protections afforded by citizen male relatives. Some found economic niches in textile production, market selling, or specialized occupations like midwifery. Others worked in entertainment or sexual commerce, professions generally considered inappropriate for citizen women, but among the few available options for foreign women without resources. Bookmark. Score VQ6D2B3. The medic experience reflected fundamental contradictions in Greek concepts of community. Greek cities economically depended on these foreign residents while politically excluding them, benefited from their cultural contributions while maintaining their otherness, and demanded their military service while denying them the rights such service supposedly justified. This systematic incorporation of necessary outsiders who remained perpetually marginal reveals the limitations of Greek democratic ideals and the pragmatic compromises that allowed their communities to function despite their exclusionary principles. Bookmark. VQ6D2. The ancient Greeks had complex relationships with the non-Greek peoples they encountered through trade, colonization, and warfare. These interactions reveal much about Greek identity, values, and blind spots when confronting cultural differences. The concept of barbarian, barbaros, originally referred simply to those who did not speak Greek, with the term onomatopoeically suggesting the unintelligible bar sound of foreign languages to Greek ears. Over time, however, the term acquired increasingly negative connotations, suggesting not merely linguistic difference, but cultural inferiority. This linguistic chauvinism became fundamental to Greek identity. To be Greek was to speak Greek, participate in Greek cultural practices, and share certain values distinct from those of surrounding peoples. Bookmark. VQ6D2N-UFB3. Persian civilization presented the most significant other against which Greeks defined themselves, particularly after the Persian Wars, 492 to 479 BCE. Despite Persian administrative sophistication, architectural achievements, and religious developments, Greek sources consistently portrayed Persians as effeminate, servile, and morally corrupt, characterizations that said more about Greek anxieties than Persian realities. The great king of Persia became the archetypal despot in Greek political thought, a counterpoint to Greek ideals of limited governance and citizen participation. Bookmark. VQ-D2-AB3. The reality of Greek-Persian relations was far more complex than this ideological opposition suggested. Before and after the Persian Wars, substantial cultural exchange occurred. Greek physicians, craftspeople, and mercenaries found employment at the Persian court. Persian luxury goods, administrative techniques, and artistic motifs influenced Greek practices. Diplomatic relationships between Persian satraps and Greek cities were often pragmatic rather than ideologically driven. This practical interaction contrasted sharply with the rhetorical opposition maintained in Greek literature and public discourse. Egyptian civilization presented a different type of other in Greek thought. Unlike the Persians, Egyptians were characterized as possessors of ancient wisdom and religious knowledge that predated Greek developments. Greek thinkers like Plato referenced Egyptian sources to add authority to their own ideas. Herodotus devoted substantial attention to Egyptian customs, often exaggerating their differences from Greek practices. This simultaneous fascination and distancing created a contradictory relationship where Egyptian culture was both admired and considered fundamentally alien. Bookmark VQSD2E3. Phoenician contributions to Greek civilization were substantial but frequently downplayed in Greek sources. The Greek alphabet derived directly from Phoenician script, with even the names of letters preserving their Semitic origins. Alpha from Aleph, Beta from Beth, etc. Phoenician maritime technology, trading practices, and manufacturing techniques heavily influenced Greek development. Yet Greek mythology and literature often portrayed Phoenicians as cunning, untrustworthy traders, early examples of ethnic stereotyping that obscured genuine cultural debt and ongoing exchange. Bookmark VQ6D2. Thracians and Scythians to the north were characterized in Greek sources as primitive, violent, and excessively fond of alcohol, but also possessing certain admirable qualities, including horsemanship and martial prowess. These northern peoples served as both trading partners and sources of slaves for Greek markets, creating economic relationships that contradicted the cultural distancing in Greek representations. The Thracian god Sabazios became partially incorporated into Greek religion through identification with Dionysus, demonstrating the selective cultural borrowing that occurred despite supposed barbarian inferiority. Bookmark V6D2. The peoples of Italy and Sicily, including Etruscans and various Italic tribes, engaged extensively with Greek colonists in those regions, creating hybrid cultures that combined Greek and local elements. Archaeological evidence reveals the adoption of Greek architectural features, artistic techniques, and religious practices by local elites, alongside Greek adoption of local agricultural methods, food traditions, and tactical innovations. These cultural borderlands demonstrated the malleability of Greek identity in colonial contexts, where pragmatic adaptation often overcame ideological notions of Greek superiority. Bookmark VQ60T2. Black Africans from regions beyond Egypt appeared in Greek art and occasionally in historical accounts, though direct contact was limited. Greek artistic representations show awareness of physical differences without the developed racial ideologies of later periods. Some black individuals achieved prominence in Greek contexts, like the boxer Nicias mentioned in inscriptions. However, Greeks generally classified humans by cultural and linguistic attributes rather than developing systematic racial categorizations, though they did associate physical characteristics with assumed cultural and climate influences. Bookmark VQ6D2. Jewish communities existed in some Greek cities, particularly in the Hellenistic period, creating another significant cultural interface. The translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, represented a major project of cultural translation. Some Jewish thinkers, like Philo of Alexandria, developed philosophical systems integrating Greek philosophical concepts with Jewish theology. These interactions presaged the complex relationship between Hellenistic culture and monotheistic traditions that would shape later Mediterranean history. Bookmark VQSD. Trade networks extended Greek contact far beyond the Mediterranean basin. Archaeology confirms Greek goods reaching Central Asia via Persian intermediaries, while Central Asian objects occasionally appear in Greek contexts. The Black Sea trade connected Greeks to the steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia. More limited evidence suggests potential indirect contact with India, with certain philosophical concepts showing intriguing parallels that remain debated by scholars. These extended networks placed Greeks within a much broader, ancient world system than their own literature typically acknowledged. Bookmark 3. Actual knowledge about distant peoples remained limited and heavily mythologized. Herodotus's accounts of distant cultures mix occasional accurate observations with fantastic elements and cultural projections. Beyond the relatively familiar territories of Egypt, Persia, and surrounding regions, Greek geographical knowledge quickly gave way to legendary constructs populated by fabulous beings and improbable customs. These imagined geographies revealed more about Greek conceptual frameworks than about the actual diversity of human societies. Bookmark VQ62. Despite frequent claims of Greek exceptionalism, virtually every significant aspect of Greek civilization incorporated elements from surrounding cultures. Architectural techniques from Egypt and the Near East influenced Greek temple design. Religious concepts from Thrace, Asia Minor, and Egypt entered Greek cults. Agricultural methods, metallurgical techniques, and textile production all incorporated non-Greek innovations. This profound hybridity contrasted sharply with the rhetorical boundaries Greeks constructed between themselves and barbarians. Bookmark VQ60. The Greek experience of cultural contact demonstrates patterns that would recur throughout history. The simultaneous borrowing of practical techniques alongside ideological rejection of their sources. The use of constructed others to define communal identity. And the development of elaborate justifications for economic exploitation of peoples deemed culturally inferior. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize similar processes in our own time, where cultural exchange and cultural boundary making continue to operate simultaneously. We have journeyed far from the pristine marble columns and philosophical dialogues that dominate popular images of ancient Greece. By examining the harsh realities of daily life, the systemic exploitation that underpinned celebrated achievements, and the voices excluded from the historical record, we develop a more complete understanding of this complex civilization, one that neither diminishes genuine accomplishments nor ignores their troubling contexts. Bookmark. The physical hardships of Greek life, from inadequate housing and sanitation to primitive medical care and constant food insecurity, remind us how recently humanity has achieved basic material security. The remarkable intellectual and artistic achievements of ancient Greece emerged not from comfort, but from struggle, created by individuals living with physical challenges we would find nearly intolerable. This perspective might prompt us to question whether material progress necessarily correlates with cultural and intellectual advancement, and to appreciate more fully the physical security many modern people take for granted. The stark social hierarchies of Greek society, the systematic exclusion of women from public life, the exploitation of enslaved people, the marginalization of foreigners, force us to confront the profound moral limitations of a civilization we often idealize. The Greek achievement is not diminished by acknowledging these failures, but rather properly contextualized as the product of specific social arrangements that enabled certain kinds of excellence while foreclosing others. We are challenged to consider what voices, perspectives, and potential contributions are similarly excluded in our own social arrangements. The precarity that characterized life for most Greeks, their vulnerability to warfare, disease, economic disruption, and natural disaster, created a fundamentally different relationship to existence than many modern people experience. Greek philosophical traditions from Stoicism to Epicureanism emerged directly from this context, offering frameworks for finding meaning and maintaining dignity amid conditions that could not be controlled. These approaches to uncertainty and suffering retain their relevance in a contemporary world where stability increasingly appears illusory. The Greek capacity for both extraordinary insight and profound blindness within the same intellectual traditions offers a humbling lesson about the limitations of human understanding. The same culture that developed democratic governance and ethical philosophy also justified slavery and denied women's intellectual capacity. This contradiction reminds us to approach our own certainties with greater humility, recognizing that future generations may find our moral blind spots as obvious as we find those of the Greeks. Perhaps most importantly, seeing ancient Greece in its full complexity, its achievements inseparable from its failures, its insights emerging from specific social contexts, helps us develop a more mature relationship with history itself. Rather than seeking idealized golden ages or simplistic narratives of progress, we recognize the messy, contradictory nature of human societies across time. Neither uncritically celebrating nor dismissively condemning the past, we can engage with it as a resource for understanding our own contingent position in history's ongoing development. The Greeks themselves valued self-knowledge above all forms of understanding. By examining their civilization honestly, acknowledging both its remarkable heights and disturbing depths, we honor that value more authentically than through idealization. The marble remains beautiful, but the shadows it casts and the foundation upon which it rests become part of a more complete picture, one that helps us see not just ancient Greece, but ourselves with greater clarity. The story of ancient Greece, properly told, is not primarily about gods and heroes, philosophers and artists, but about human beings, creating meaning, seeking security, building communities, and struggling with limitations both physical and moral. In their triumphs and failures, their insights and blindnesses, we recognize our own humanity reflected across the centuries, neither diminished by time nor fundamentally transformed. That recognition, more than any specific achievement, may be the most valuable legacy they offer